Hi, everybody. Welcome to Quiet Before. This conversation has been really long awaited by Carolyn and I. We're very excited and honored to be here with Charlie Lai and Jack Tchen. Um, we are going to allow the conversation to flow very naturally, but Carolyn and I obviously have a lot of questions. Um, but we're going to start with Carolyn. Carolyn's going to introduce herself. And I'll just say that the first time I met Charlie was my first day working at Mocha Mulberry Street. And I walked in and I'd been hired, but I'd never known or met Charlie. And I did not know my life was going to change so dramatically after that day. And both Jack and Charlie have been a huge inspiration to me and really have gone on to shape a lot of how I think about community. And while it's been a long time since I left Mocha, it really remains and continues to be a part of everything I do. So I just want to thank you both off the bat. And I'm going to introduce my great collaborator, Carolyn Antonio from Womankind, to share her background with these two.
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. Hi, Charlie. Hi, Jack. As Nancy has said, this is a conversation we have been hungry for, waiting for, and are just thankful for. I'll just, by way of background, just share that I also started my journey with Mocha and with the two of you with Charlie. And I started first as a consultant and as a grant writing consultant right after 9/11, given the opportunities that were coming to the community, to Chinatown, on how to rebuild. And I had known about Mocha, and I had known it was a special place because of the history that it had preserved in its original space. But I hadn't known the people very closely. And my gig was only supposed to be a consultant, and then after maybe a year of working together, Charlie says, "Oh, come on over as a full-time staffer just for 2 years, and then you could go back to your writing and your community work and controlling your time." And I remember thinking, yeah, that sounds good. We'll get the first initial funding. And what happens is that I then wind up staying at Mocha and making it my home for literally 10 years. So when I think about it, really Mocha, like for Nancy, it holds a very special place in my heart. And Charlie, you have been a mentor to me. And Jack, you have been an inspiration to me as I've gotten to know you as well. And so truly, truly grateful to have this conversation and to have you in our lives and in the community's lives. So thank you. And so I'm going to turn it over to whoever wants to go first, Charlie or Jack, to just introduce yourselves.
So you fell for that line of just for 2 years, huh?
I totally did. And we joke, he sold me the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm like, ah, was it because I was from New Jersey? But I am from Jersey City. So, maybe the sixth borough of New York for you New Yorkers, maybe.
That's very nice for you guys to say that. And I think so much of it is that uh, uh, I think just going back to why, and how we got together between Jack and I, wanted to do the right thing, trying to understand community, that for so many years now. I mean, we could just think back on, gee, when was the first time we met at basement? That trying to carry that collaborative work and honest conversation. I think that flows through to and trying to hold true to those the way of working. So I'm really glad that you guys felt that way, even though I sold you the Brooklyn Bridge. That that there is some positive impact to your life. So I think that that's a very nice thing for you guys to say that. So I've learned now that the more so in that I'm working over at Chong Park with the much more intimate with the older residents, right? The older community folks in Chinatown that they. So I'm learning now to give more respect to my elders now. So and I've been so completely irreverent throughout my life. So now I'm going to give Jack a chance to talk about how he got to basement since he's my elder.
I was just gonna ask,
A little twist there.
are you calling Jack your elder?
Yeah. So I'm learning also now to also talk about chronological age now. I think it's really a transitional time that for the longest time of working in Chinatown, it is forever. There is no end in sight that I could always get into doing something and to be able to accomplish it. So there's no end timeline. But increasingly, I have to think about if I'm going to enter into doing some work, I now have to bracket in terms of time. How much time it would take to complete that task or create the sufficient foundation necessary for someone to carry on to make that happen. And it's really weird to think of it in that way. So, but I guess this is part of us, or at least I'm recognizing that that there is a limit to what I can do on my own, even with a great collaborative team. That my tenure will be scaled back, and that it would be necessary to have others to actually make make everything else possible without me.
Charlie, you haven't turned 70 yet.
That's why I'm giving you the due respect as my elder. Okay.
So I was born in 1951, so I'm 71 now. Charlie's what, 2 years, 3 years? I forget how much younger you are. I mean, when I first met you, it seemed like you were younger, but at this point, there's no there's no real difference, right? Yeah, there's something about, I think, the 70s, being in the 70s, that is actually precious in the sense that one values decisions about time much more so. Whereas I think when we started, when we met at Basement and we started the ideas for the New York Chinatown History Project, time just seemed to be endless. And there is so much time ahead of us, and we could just say, okay, sure, yeah, we'll do this. And we had no idea how long it's going to take. And, the job is never done, right? So it's just ongoing. The history is as infinite as the number of people and the experiences and the complicated histories and conditions in which a place like Chinatown in New York emerges from, but also everything's transformed, since then. Who would have thought that China would be the second largest economy, if not the first largest economy in the world, and all the changes that have happened and all the changes that are now still going on as we move into kind of a new Cold War, as the United States is positioning itself in a new Cold War against China. I mean, these are very complicated things. So in some ways, time is stretched out, but also things loop back, so in some ways things are not so different when we started, Charlie, back so many years ago. But for me, I think decisions that I make now are more carefully considered, but in some ways no less I was going to say no less silly, but no less expansive might be the better way to say. So I'm actually in the process of making a 10-year plan here at Rutgers in New York, which seems, so Charlie, it's kind of the opposite. It's the opposite from what you're saying, but in some ways it's the same, because I realize that if I'm going to make some things happen during this moment in which global warming, climate chaos, everything is kind of hitting the fan, that it's going to take some time to do that. And it's going to take pulling together an amazing range of people to make that happen. So I think learning from the past 40 some years, I'm realizing how much time it takes to do things too, and that therefore it also means that I have to be more careful in the choices I make and the people I'm working with, and what is it that are the core values that I'm trying to bring to this, and what kind of people I'm looking for to bring together, right? So, so in some ways, I'm being a little more careful, but I'm also being reckless in terms of just thinking, oh, 10 years, no problem. Right? And Charlie, when we started, we were thinking, oh, we can do this for a few more years.
Yep.
That's all it's going to take. We can just kind of get, it was an arrogance, but also a lack of experience, that we were imagining we can do so much in a short amount of time. So in any case, I'm jumping ahead to the New York Chinatown History Project, but maybe we should begin earlier, I guess, when we first met.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great segue. You were talking about choosing the people you work with. So maybe one way of asking the question of how you and Charlie met is like, how did you and Charlie meet, and how did you choose each other?
Well, I've always been aware of what I don't know. And, growing up in the Midwest, not growing up in an Asian or Chinatown or Chinese American community, my mother was always telling me from one ear that don't get too used to this country. We're going to go back to China. I was the anchor baby also of enabling them to stay in this country. So the stories I was hearing from my mother, but also my siblings, were really about a China that was about the Opium War. And they spoke of it, my mother spoke of it as if it had happened like just a few years ago. And that strong kind of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist attitude is something that I just grew up with. But at the same time, she never felt comfortable being in the United States. And I think communicated that not belonging and not being at home to me. And then, being a little bit slow sometimes with my mother, especially, I finally realized, oh, wait a minute, I think we are staying here, and I'm an American, so I think by the time I got out of college, which, that's why I'm slow, and met Charlie, I had, reckoned with the fact that, oh, I am in this country and I need to find where my home is. And my home was certainly not in the prairie of the Midwest, where the streets are named after indigenous peoples and tribes who were no longer there. And so I really was kind of looking, and New York Chinatown seemed to be a good place to start looking. And so people I started connecting up with were Fei Chang, and a lot of the people at Basement Workshop. And Fei and other people had raised monies to get city summer funds for people in college and younger. And that's really, as far as I remember, it's how I first met Charlie, because Charlie was one of those students at Princeton at the time who was a part of a whole group of amazing fellow classmates from different universities. And I started meeting them and talking to them. And I think for me, Charlie was the one who was willing to talk to me and willing to kind of answer questions, and really willing to talk about Chinatown in a way that could help me understand what the community was all about. And being trained as a Western style historian, because that's what academia does in this country, I just had lots of questions, and I wanted to kind of understand as much as I could. And not everybody who grows up in Chinatown necessarily wants to talk about that to someone from the outside, And but Charlie, in some ways, was also a bit of an outsider, because he lived way over there on Forsyth Street, which was not considered by the hardcore Chinatown people. That wasn't Chinatown. That was like a few streets over past Chinatown, right? So in some ways, I think Charlie had that sense of an outsider, but also a deep kind of post 65, 68 immigration insight into the layers of Chinatown and the subtleties of Chinatown. And he also played basketball with a great group of guys that I occasionally would play with, but by that time I was way too slow and way too polite as a Midwestern basketball player to really do well with that team, you know, so that's what I remember.
Jack, what was Charlie like when you sort of first met him?
Well, I mean, Charlie,
Not
those
be
of
very
you
kind, okay?
um, well, those of you who remember Charlie from those years know that Charlie always wore a green army surplus jacket around. You know, okay, so people tend to think of, okay, so my family is a tall family. I've got brothers who are tall. My grandfather, who I never met, was tall. Charlie is shorter. And you know, there's attitudes in my family about, you know, what does it mean to, I think it comes out of eugenic attitudes, quite frankly, but, you know, what does it mean to be shorter? What does it mean to be fatter? What does it mean to be, you know, whatever? And that there's a certain kind of attitude in my family that, you know, people should look a certain way, and that had something to do with their intelligence, which of course is not true. Right? But I quickly learned that Charlie, even though he was shorter, has this sharp, analytical mind that can go in so many different directions at the same time. Anytime you bring up anything, Charlie has many thoughts about it. And it opened up lots of avenues for discussions, long conversations. So I found during the time that Charlie was around Basement during the summer, things were not so structured that we could just actually, you know, talk, right? And that's one of the amazing experiences that I had being around Basement Workshop, is that there are just amazing people coming from all parts of the country and all parts of New York City and all parts of the region. So that includes New Jersey. Now that I work in New Jersey, it includes New Jersey. And that's why it was such a special place. And it also wasn't like so manic about working certain hours that people actually took the time to actually talk, you know. So I think that's where I really learned so much. I had quit a PhD program at the University of Wisconsin, which was full freight, you know, but so my real education was really being at Basement Workshop for those years, and then starting up the New York Chinatown History Project. So Basement Workshop was kind of like, you know, just a chance to really learn about people's lives and the differences from my background, and to also gain a sense of community and a sense of what home meant for people, but also what it could mean for me as well. So that's how I met Charlie.
Two quick questions before we go over to Charlie. How long had, actually three questions. How long had Basement been in existence by the time you and Charlie met there? And then how long did you stay involved with Basement before it dissolved?
Well, I didn't arrive to Basement until the fall of '75. And Basement had already been through various incarnations by that time. So I'm really more a part of a, I don't know what wave to count it as, but in the very least, a second or third group of people who started coming from elsewhere into New York and making decisions about, even before I left, that I wanted to go to Basement just to learn about things, you know. So I had met people, I had met Takashi Yanagira, who was traveling around across the country. He's from West Coast originally, but he had been deeply involved in Basement. And Takashi, in the Asian American Student Organization that I had helped organize at Wisconsin, was talking about Basement. And I had received Bridge magazine, but also heard about an oral history project that had begun. But by the time I arrived in New York in the fall of '75, there was a massive political split in the organization. That's a longer story. And Basement had was kind of just literally pulling together the fragments and pieces of what was left. And the political groups that had formed that or thought of themselves as vanguard organizations had split off and focused on kind of organizing politically. And the people who were left at basement were people who were considered people who did quote unquote cultural work or daycare programs or the resource center, which is where I kind of just started picking up boxes and books and fragments of photographs and things like that. So it was kind of a strange moment in which an organization that I imagined was so amazing and so together had just basically imploded and kind of fallen apart. So in that vacuum, I was just lucky because I was willing to kind of go there on a regular basis and volunteer. And eventually things started picking up again and getting organized. Fei Chang played a very key role during that time. She's someone who's, I think, underappreciated, under-recognized. At the time, she was really, I think, understood to be very key. But in retrospect, I think people who do publications or speak the loudest tend to have reputations and have their legacies remembered. She was actually a pretty quiet person, but fiercely intelligent and fiercely strategic and capable. So I worked with Fei quite a bit and met other people through Fei, and then Fei applied for these city CETA. It was CETA, right, Charlie? Yeah. CETA grants, and that's really how people like Charlie began arriving during the summers. And we would have, 30, 40, I think, I can't remember the summer when you started, Charlie, or when you were around. It was like, 70, I don't know. There are a lot of CETA students. It seemed like a lot. So suddenly an organization that didn't have that many people in it kind of ballooned over the summer, and just a huge group of young people, many of them college aged, just started arriving, and we started dreaming what could be done, in places like parks and other places. So that's really, so Charlie and that generation of amazing organizer, activists, thinkers that Charlie was a part of began arriving in Chinatown. So in some ways, they represented for me another wave of people who had similar backgrounds to me in some ways, being from other places, and also bringing in a certain kind of, educational training from mainstream universities into a community context, which had its problems and limits, but also it meant that people brought a lot of really interesting skills and perspectives. So yeah, so I think that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
But I do want to clarify a little bit in terms of there are two types of programs. I think the CETA program was actually for the older individuals, artists, and other kinds of workers. But it's a summer youth program.
Right.
That was a separate grouping of the young kids in Chinatown. So there's a combination of using some of that money to have the CETA monies to have the supervisory type staff versus the students, the high school students, that kind of thing. So but it's a combination of that kind of funding, including, of course, Fei being quite instrumental along with you, putting together the grants, right, from on the state level, right, and the state level for city funding related to the arts. So that supported many of the arts and cultural type workers within basement during that period of time. So,
Charlie, before you introduce how you came to the basement workshop and how you and Jack met, I just want to ask, when you met Jack, did you all feel like you had an immediate sort of understanding and like kindredness, or was it more that you both felt very mysterious to each other, and that was what sort of grew the bond?
It really should be just simply told as this interesting moment when I was a sophomore and needed a summer job, and so it's through the work study program that I found a place that I wanted to be, and which is at basement. And so as a work study student during that moment in the 75, 76 summer, that the basement moved from 22 Catherine Street on the second floor to the seventh floor loft on Lafayette Street. It was completely empty space, and so it was at a moment where basement needed a whole lot of hands to physically build the space. And so, for me, when I got in with, a couple of, actually with Led, being one of the, my, uh, my student, colleagues, right? So, um, and we had this, so we're both cutting up sheetrock and nailing up the wall. And so, I was perfectly happy doing some of that. And then I also realized that I could do more than that. And so just one day I went into the office and I was just saying to Faye and also to Patsy, I said, I don't mind putting up the walls, and I'm learning a lot of new tricks, and carpentry and also um, um, electrical work, etc. But I could also do something else. I want to do something else. And so she then simply looked at Patsy, and that's Faye looking at Patsy and say, "Yeah, why don't you go to the back?" And so and where's the back? The back is where the resource center is, and Jack, being in that hole in the back, um, dealing with the boxes of books and stuff, and so and when I walk into the back, then I realize like books, so there is no relationship at all. It's like books, my God, and but over time, I think that um, um, and this is also at a point in time where being the young kid putting up a wall and in a space where there are lots of artists, you know um, um, uh, Chinatown born and bred kids, that they think that they own the space, to those who are dancers and really a bunch of artistic type folks, right? And they're they're a little crazy, right? So, and I don't care for arts either. So anyway, um, and you know, I came with an attitude. The attitude is that as Jack was saying, that I grew up on um, Forsyth Street, which is just outside of the core of Chinatown. And so those Chinatown born and bred think they own Chinatown, but they don't, right? So as someone that grew up in the streets, it is, how do you, fight for territory and turf and establish and claim that you belong? And so it's, being a basement is a similar process that I belong, I'm better than you are, and you cannot then say that, that you have a certain turf and I can't venture into that. So, um, and, and so, in many ways, right, walking through the front office into the back, I had to navigate through, the open space where the martial artists would do their thing, or the dance people would then try to carve out their own little spaces, and the artists would also want to do some things, and the sound studio want to do some other things, and the wood shop want to do other things, right? So they're having to navigate the little territories of fiefdoms into that back area, and so the back area is where Jack and some of the folks that are not typically Chinatown, or because they're from the Midwest or somewhere else, and mostly actually turned out to be that, right? In terms of the group that hung out in the back were Jen and Don and others that are not Chinatown, New York Chinatown. So and through going in there and finding that uh, I could talk to folks, and that's over time that the with a conversation rather than um, uh, uh, rather than kind of like a street language, how do you test each other kind of a thing. So it's a different kind of relationship. So uh, and then over time they just said, we can actually talk rather than just simply posturing. So that was actually quite important. Um, and that the um, uh, but in many ways, I was more in many ways I was prepared, right, from my being at Princeton, that there is an intellectual side to a conversation rather than typically using the what um, I had grown up with, right, and meaning that I came to the States in '65 with the first wave of immigrants coming to the United States. So, and uh, growing up on Forsyth Street, which is the part of Lower East Side that you know, um, um, it's, the street life. You have to fight for, your status, your survival. And at that moment um, in the 60s and the early 70s, right? Gangs were huge. And it dramatically altered how um, um, kids um, um, grow up, and getting through, both the language gap, learning the language, um, dealing with, some sense of education so that you can move from, grade to grade level, um, and then, and making friends or not, and basketball and sport is part of that. How do you address the concrete jungle issues? So all of those things were part of my growing up, and so um, uh, it is not to say that that I had a chip on my shoulders, which I do have, um, but it is literally having to navigate survival, um, and and um, uh, and at the same time, um, how does one you know establish oneself as somewhat true and not to be a pushover, right? So survival can be very meek. You become the studious individual, and not to deal with anything. Um, but I play more, and we are roaming the streets all the time. And by definition, you're interacting with others, um, and sometimes borderline, you know, um, uh, 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 borderline socially, unacceptable, behaviors because you're in a group. And how does that brace against, gang activities? Um, and so, um, learning early on, right, that there has to be um, a you know a sense of self, so that you could garner the necessary respect in the streets to survive in a gang environment. So, um, so that attitude, came with me throughout um, um, my adult life, and um, um, at the same time, there's also a sense of being somewhat aware that uh, how do you you know look at things and see things that are not being fair, and doing something about it. So, um, and I was extremely, advantaged in terms of um, things come easily to me, in terms of learning, um, and so I did really well in school. I didn't have to try, and that uh, and so it gave me a lots of flexibility and freedoms to um, again, not just doing well in school, but um, to be able to find a pathway, right, to opportunities, um, and at the same time, being in the streets, allowing me to be in the streets all the time, so that I could actually learn, how to do well in the streets, right? To be more streetwise, and so that combination was really part of my core being. And so, uh, and given the opportunities that I was able to get to, Princeton, and there was a whole network of organizers, or at least my exposure to other students all up and down the East Coast, and we were looking to do some stuff in Chinatown to give back, because no matter how advantaged that we were, or I was in Chinatown, that getting to Princeton was a completely different world. I thought I owned Princeton too, and realizing that that place wasn't for me, and that there are things that on the college campuses that needed to change, and so being exposed to some of the early speakers from the Asian American movement, through Basement and others, that they speak on campuses, and hearing for the first time that there's this thing called, an Asian American identity. We have histories there. It's very different from my growing up in Chinatown. I know who I am. I'm very confident as to who I am, that I am part of the city of New York, right? The greatest city in and the and the Lower East Side, the greatest area in the country, right? So I am extraordinarily confident as to who I am, but taking that confidence and placing myself into the world of Princeton, really shattered, that wait a minute, that my world is not, the world is that is actually at large, especially in the context that all of those Ivy League students, right, are being trained to run the country, and that's that kind of thinking, that whoever I am as an individual from Chinatown is an irrelevant part of their lives, or what they perceive and what they think, um, to be relevant in the rest of the country. So, so anyway, that was having that exposure to speakers from the Asian, the older Asian American movement, allowed me to think about this dichotomy, and I don't know much about that part of the history, or so it gave me that sense that I want to work in work at Basement. So
So Charlie, what?
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you. I was going to say, what's coming up for me as you're speaking is, I wrote down here, juxtaposition, right? You were talking about your urban upbringing, and then being in a place like Princeton, your personal journey, and then also you being in the front and then finding Jack in the back with the books. Also, a juxtaposition of sorts, right? Things that might not normally come together or might not normally meet. But what's coming up for me is that it's actually in those intersections where things open up, where things are cracked open. And so I'm going to shift it a little bit, if you don't mind. And Nancy, feel free to jump in as well. Could you speak to the moment or moments, or the thinking, and maybe some of the coalitions that contributed to the initial seed of, the Chinatown History Project, or MOCA? Just how all of that, what you've just shared personally, the dynamics that you navigated, the differences that you might have actually leveraged to come together, along with the larger community that you were part of. How did that take all of that, and perhaps speak to the journey then to the beginnings of the museum, of the Chinatown History Project, and then what would eventually become the museum? I don't know who wants to take that.
Right. Yeah, my being and this the journey, right? First being exposed by, through the exposure to the Asian American, leadership, right? And and you're thinking that um, uh, we have a place. What is that place? We're not quite sure. And that my doing student organizing on campuses, um, and then coming back to Chinatown to work in this sense of it's my community, you know, the, the community suck. There's so many problems, and things need to be better. Growing up in the streets, gangs and what was horrible, right? I was extremely fortunate to get through, those difficulties that most people, most kids would have to get through. But it's also, dealing with the, economic situations, right? My parents, my father worked as a cook, in a restaurant. My mother worked, in the garment factory. And this is, what is the economic foundation of the community. Do it have any, ability to venture outside of, the general area beyond the Lansing Street? Um, they don't. So, you know, and I'm in this one place that I am in the middle of all that, and I have been catapulted right to a place where people go to France for for the weekend, right? So and come to work in Chinatown, it's all about I wanted to right in the sense of justice and fairness, right? Is I need to make this community better. I have to be part of this, um, because I don't think that anyone um, um, need to. No, let me just rephrase, right? That um, no matter how smart that I think I am, um, yeah, I didn't get into Princeton all on my own. People opened the doors for me to get there, and I could do no less, right? That by other than moving the door a little bit wider for others to follow. Similarly, in terms of Chinatown, right, is that I have been given the opportunities. How can I make it more possible, right, for others to get through, and to have other opportunities? So, um, so it is about thinking about doing, making our community better, and so at Basement, given all these different elements of individuals doing things, and the folks in the back, right, we're trying to figure out who are we, what can we do, and that conversation begin to take more shape in terms of I want to do um, you know, I want to better the community, but then when Jack and others are asking what is this community, right? Who is part of this community? Is it the the different fiefdoms within Basement from one corner to the next, you know, to you know uh, to uh, understanding that um, uh, you know is it the streets that I grew up in, or is it something more than that? What do we know? And so that's those conversations Jack and I were having because Jack was literally probing, right? What is this place? Why these people here? Um, and so I guess Jack could talk more about that. But it is through Jack almost literally constantly quizzing me, right, as to what is that. And I just lived that life, and I was just talking about it. So.
Well, it should first be said, we were all kind of smiling and laughing when Charlie was saying there's books in the back, right? Yeah. I mean, anybody who knows Charlie will have him soon tell you that I don't read books. I don't read books at all. And, I've mainly understood the world being isolated, growing up in the Midwestern prairies through books, because that was the only way I had people that I could be in conversation with people who could help me understand the history, the historical context, make sense of what my mother was saying to me versus what I was seeing around me in the very white suburban world where inner city Polish and Jewish and Italians would go leave the city and become white, right? So that was the process of people becoming white after the war, after World War II and after the Korean War. So for me, I was just trying to make sense of what was going on. And I had a sense that somehow Chinatown was a good place to go to. But, it's not like everybody was welcoming everybody, everybody was kind of trying to figure out a place to find themselves. And a lot of people went to basement and left because it was not always welcoming, right? But I think for those of us who could find a little niche, a little corner, a little niche, would stay and then find other people who are also looking for that. So in some ways, basement was a very dynamic community in which people ended up kind of finding each other and maybe could drift from one corner to another corner and do different things, And we were all aware that people were doing different things. And there's a kind of begrudging respect, I think, that people somehow managed to stay there, even though there are big differences, and wanted to do something that was connected, right? So, so for me, I just had those questions. And I also, as I was just walking around the streets, was picking up stuff from the garbage. On my CV, I talk about being a dumpster diver. And I mean that very honestly, because I'm always looking for little fragments that to me represent something of the past or some connection to something that is not evident, and a way to kind of learn and to read and to understand, what's happening. And Chinatown in 75 and into 1979, when we started working on the New York Chinatown History Project idea in the form of a proposal, but we had to make some really clear decisions. And to make those clear decisions, we had lots of conversations, really endless conversations that led to that. Chinatown was going through a profound change because the immigration laws in 65 that hit in 68 that brought people like Charlie's family and everybody else and people I met at the University of Wisconsin, the immigration restriction exclusion laws were being repealed. And all of a sudden there were thousands of people, families, and their children coming into Chinatown, and then they're growing up in and around Chinatown and in and around communities in New York. And there's a change of people who had been there forever, the quote unquote old timers who had been there forever, and they were being displaced, but also they're aging out of some of the old Chinatown apartments that they were in, and the stores were changing. So there's just lots of stuff being thrown out. And I was like shocked, because I grew up, my father was a bibliographer. He ended up working at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. So I kind of grew up with books in the house, and also this sense that these artifacts, these quote unquote artifacts, were important, and that if old things are thrown out, then I should collect them. So I just started picking up stuff, and I think it was really through that interaction of that moment of change in Chinatown that I would come back and talk to Charlie and Faye and other people to help me understand what was going on. And bit by bit, those fragments, I think, started for me formulating a larger set of questions and possibilities of what can we do to create a space in Chinatown that can help pull together some of the different fragments of Chinatown. Because part of what was clear from some of my classmates at Wisconsin who were from New York Chinatown and from New York is that they didn't understand what was happening, what the old Chinatown was about. So one of my classmates who was from New York Chinatown said, "Oh yeah, we really thought those old guys were kind of perverted. I mean, they didn't know what to think of them. And they thought of them as like these old guys over there who had nothing to do with their backgrounds or their, but in fact, they're all part of the same history and the same history of immigration and the same history of exclusion and everything else. So for me, I had that kind of historical framing from a Western point of view. And I was trying to understand how to make sense of what people were saying to me and then what I was seeing on the streets. and then asking questions about that. And that's really, I think, in some ways why I started just collecting things and started asking people about them, and began thinking that some awareness of the history could actually help what was changing in Chinatown, and that the new immigrants who were families, right? The older, as everybody knows, the older Chinatown were the laws were such that it really kept the workers from having families, even though families did begin to emerge, but out of resistance. And it privileged the merchants. So the merchants were able to set up their families and really do well. But as these new immigrants came in, they were coming as families. There were new children emerging. Some of them were born in Hong Kong, like Charlie and his older brother, Ed, or some of them were born in this country, like, the younger members of Charlie's family. And we could begin to see the generational differences, that were happening, and also the transformations. But also there's a question that Chinatown had never had any respect or representation in New York City, except for those who are the heads of some of the powerful merchant associations. So because of exclusion, the merchants were able to be more powerful. The laundry workers and restaurant workers had very little power. They were dispersed. So this question of representation and understanding of the new immigrants about the older immigrants began, for me at least, began to formulate a kind of really interesting challenge of how history can actually bridge. And, of course, that was very theoretical, it was abstract, but that began to form the early ideas that we began talking about.
And that's right. I think that what we were, through our discussions, right, about trying to help us understand what is this community, right? And so in going back to my student organizing was to try to figure out, well, what are you organizing for? What are you, what is the issue you're addressing? If you don't understand the issue, you cannot then figure out what you need to do. I mean, just simply picketing ain't gonna do anything, right? So it is through that constant search for what is this community, which part do we know, what other parts that we did not know. And so the more we talk, the more we realize that we got to have much more information so that we could then affect a deeper change. And even when we were, even when I was being segmented off to do more the youth-related work, right? It is then trying to also address, well, what kind of activities should they be involved in? How do we take that opportunity not just for them to have a summer job, at minimum wage, but also to learn something. And the staff that will be managing, supervising, the some youth workers, what do they need to have in order to do good, supervisory work, and also, providing some kind of an access point, right, for the younger generations to then be able to, right, get into college or think about college, but maybe even beyond, city college, right, because many of the folks that I was able to bring to the table for that kind of work were my my classmates, right, from the different colleges, right. So to then quote give back, but actually to learn about the community itself, and so that there is in fact also an opportunity for them to apply their skill sets into a community where they came from, or a community that's close to where they came from. So there are multiple things over time since us connecting 76, 77, 78, constant talking and griping, about how basement was at a moment in time from the empty lot to, a really, in some ways, a supercharged organization doing really, good things, and then they begin to collapse. Um, and 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 I was interested in understanding in terms of just as my doing student organizing on a on a regional and a national basis, that there is a constant struggle as to who's leading it, why they leading it, what are we supposed to do, and that similar set of issues being young students were happening within basement in terms of how decisions are being made, ego and people having a certain sense of direction, but not necessarily want to do the work to make things happen. So I was extremely frustrated as a very young person, and questioning those who are 3, 4, 5 years older than I, supposed to be the Asian American stars. It's like, are you kidding me? Why are they doing that? And so uh, it actually informed how Jack and I talked about creating an organization that is more flat, much tighter in terms of understanding as to why we're doing this, how we're doing it, um, and that the uh, and not to be so tied into the personal stake, as in ego tripping type of thing. So and that really helped us, navigate much more of the difficult issues of how to do the day to day and how to think about the larger picture, um, and how the larger picture gets translated into a set of steps, even if we don't know exactly how they work, but we were looking to problem solve, right? That kink that we didn't see, um, but we were not averse to tinkering and taking risks, um, um, and asking questions, right? And learning from others, and so back in the day, right? That when Basement was such a strong arts organization, it was really tied in to lots of the Lower East Side arts community, and they were also at the forefront, of dealing with how art, and culture connects to community, connects to organizing, and community development, right? Um, and that actually helped create that diverse view, not just Chinatown or not just Asian American, but on the Lower East Side, the Puerto Rican community, the Black community, and then it ventured on, right? So even though um, constantly beating the dead horse about I don't care for the arts, or I don't care for history or books, but those pieces of information was very much part of a deeper understanding that it does inform how I think, and that the and how those types of methodologies or pathways are really um, important, because even though I am not an artist or photographer or a dancer or historian, those specific skill sets are vital to true community development work. But it has to be taken out of the Ivy Tower, right? Just another book that is on the shelf, but how does it get applied to to a community setting?
Yeah, I should say that I think really at root, the way Charlie and I connected is that ultimately we're both organizers. And I know people thought of me as a librarian or whatever in the back, and they didn't quite know what I was doing and the conversations we were having. But Jin Lee, Dan Kao, myself, and other people who started coming around had all been involved in the anti-war movement and organizing on the campuses that we had attended. So we did have the privilege of of being in sleepaway college, right? And having and kind of hitting college around the same time in which the war in Vietnam and anti-Asian racism and the use of the word chink and slopehead were just throughout American culture. And we were able to directly experience how the war, the US war in Southeast Asia, which was a continuation of the French war in Southeast Asia for dominance, right, was really a continuation, was linked, excuse me, to the racism that we were experiencing in this country. So that's where I think the Asian American perspective and Asian American movement perspective, actually, it's not just about racism that happens in the US, but it's about how these things work internationally. And that's different than perhaps many other groups who mainly think about the US and their rights in the US. So I think having been involved in that kind of movement organizing demonstrations, organizing publications, learning from third world, coalitions, I subscribe to Akwesasne Notes, which is coming out of the Mohawk Nation upstate New York, and Asian American publications in LA, and the Black Panther Party, publication. So I was reading all that in college and also reading about politics and all that. It was kind of an amazing time, but there's also a lot of headiness. And for me, coming to Chinatown was a chance to really work on the ground in a way that wasn't privileging all that headiness, but was really trying to take whatever was useful from what I learned in college to really try to learn about what does it mean to really organize, and not just to politically posture, or to claim something, or as Charlie was talking about, to picket something. Picketing is important, but it can't end with picketing. And there are lots of people who just went from picket line to picket line and didn't necessarily organize underneath and to sustain the deeper understanding. One thing I learned from one of my favorite historians, who's a French, an American, very thin, very gaunt. He was Harvey Goldberg, Jewish, very skinny, gay, an incredible historian. He taught us that when they're between moments of intense activity and activism, those seemingly quiet moments are when you organize, when you work with people in communities, when you do education work, when you start learning from other people. And so for me, that's always been kind of key, not so much as an academic or an intellectual, but really trying to understand. So as an organizer, then, when things don't appear to be happening, when there's no big march or no big demonstration or no big whatever, those are actually golden moments to actually understand and to learn from people, right? So for me, that's what I was trying to figure out with Charlie, how can we do that kind of work, which took the form of doing history work and pulling together dumpster diving and pulling together things. Just to kind of complete the picture of dumpster diving just for a second, because it sets up what really began to happen, is that a lot of the stores around Chatham Square, so Chatham Square just sits below Old Chinatown, right? So you have Mott, Doyers, Pell, but then just below that is Chatham Square, which is one of these under-recognized major historical hubs in the history of New York City. Those stores were just finishing up their 99-year leases. Okay, that's why all the dumpsters were appearing all of a sudden. That's why all this stuff was being thrown out, because these stores were being emptied out, and all the new Hong Kong businesses coming in were able to start their businesses, and they were just tossing out the complete contents of these 100-year stores that connected that area directly to the history of New York City. So Charlie and I never, as he was saying earlier, never really thought of our work as strictly about Chinese or Chinatown. We always thought of it in a larger context, and that the history of that multi-racial, multi-ethnic New York City, which is really in some ways the real New York City, that was being tossed out and nobody was paying attention. New York Historical Society couldn't give a shit. Because they didn't pay attention to basically working class immigrant
Mhm.
stories. They were just about elite stories, and they more or less still are, right? So, but that everyday life that was embodied in what was being tossed out in the dumpsters just struck me as like, I can't believe this is happening. Um, and and that we need to do something about it. So for me, I think even as we're formulating how new immigrants coming in need to understand that history and respect to the elders, the older laundry workers, the older restaurant workers, the older history, and understand the struggles they went through and how laundries, in contradiction to kind of arrogant merchant families who we would encounter and would be involved in different things, they would say that it was a laundryman. It was the hundreds and thousands of laundrymen, 10,000 laundries in the metropolitan region. Those were the people who created Chinatown. It wasn't the merchants. It was the regular folks who worked and made money outside and brought it in and spent the money in Chinatown. So they really created Chinatown. But so it wasn't just them, but it was also they were living in a multi-ethnic, multiracial community that had a deep history, and they were always intermingling with each other. So it's never one group or another. So when so why Charlie's basketball, group of his friends from the neighborhood were important to me is that, Butch was playing there, a black kid, right? Who was, who was as much a part of the team as anybody else, because they all knew each other from being outside of old Chinatown. They weren't just all Chinese. They were a mixture of people doing stuff together. So for me, that was like, oh, wow, that's the older community of Chatham Square and Lower East Side that people don't usually acknowledge and don't understand. If you're focused on Chinatown, you don't see that other thing that's also going on.
I just want to, because Charlie kind of evaded my question.
Oh.
I wanted to, because your friendship and collaboration is really at the heart of all of this. And, really like one of the most prominent and impactful friendships that I know of. I just wanted to see if you could both talk about, um, what that connection was. Was it a very intellectual connection? Because you both seem to have a lot of affection for each other, a lot of gentle respect, and it's a very unique dynamic. So we were wondering, how have you managed to maintain this relationship for so long? And, what is that like to have these decades of friendship, all this history together, and time that lies ahead of you, and things that you might decide to do in the future? I
I
probably
have no
made that.
idea.
Yeah, I knew it. I knew it. Maybe you're, although I bet Jack could answer this question. I want Charlie to answer this question. How you think you have had such a fruitful and respectful, warm relationship for so long?
Well, I think it's hard to say because there's a chemistry involved, and but for me, being being on a regular basis, being able to just talk and connect, and not just it's not intellectual. It's also it's connecting in a real heart-to-heart way. Oftentimes when people talk about sitting down and talking and having conversations, they think it's just intellectual or whatever, but it's not. It's far more than that. So we would oftentimes, for me, a key thing is getting together over a meal. Okay, having lunch together. We had a lot of lunches together, and a fair number of dinners together, but as well. But it's feeling the trust and comfort to speak honestly. I think ultimately that's what it is, and that's I think really our bond, is that we can be honest with each other all the time. So we can not see each other for years at a time and still get together and not always agree and not always think in the same way. I tend to be certain ways. Charlie tends to be another way. People who know us can imagine what that is. But then when we talk, we begin to kind of listen to each other and begin to kind of shift how we might normally be thinking or the direction we're going in. Or when I need to have a better understanding of something, I'll bother Charlie, and maybe he'll agree to set out some time and talk to me. It kind of depends, but we've been able to keep up this relationship, even though that period of basement and then the period of the early days of the New York Chinatown History Project were actually relatively short periods of time in which we're there day to day. But I think the day-to-day bonding we did, in which we really learned that we can trust each other on an emotional basis, on having each other's backs, which is really big deal for guys, trying to do things and trying to constantly be taking risks and going to the edge of things. Because a lot of what we did were things that were never done before, and exposing ourselves to people that most people wouldn't want to have to deal with. The grant world is a vicious world. That larger world outside in New York City, I mean, there are some really great people, but it's also a really crazy, tough world that is brutal, So I think it's really because Charlie and I could trust each other and have each other's back, especially for guys, that's a real bonding experience. And then we could, it's true for anybody, but I'm just talking about gendered patterns of relating and connecting and trusting each other, that I think through those key years in which we were really growing as organizers and trying to make things happen and to write grants that would enable us to hire people and then enlarge our circle, that I think we probably gained a confidence and a trust in each other around that. So even though we disagreed, we would be willing to go with, let's go with the way Charlie wants to do it. That makes sense to me. Or even if I didn't feel that would necessarily be the decision I would make, I would want to back up Charlie in the decision he made. So that's different than simply aligning uncritically, but it's kind of agreeing because one has been developing a longer term relationship, and one can learn that even when one doesn't always understand or exactly agree, that one can trust somebody else to do it well, and to create the conditions in which things are going to continue, or that it's time to change things up. So I think that's for me, that's a lot of it.
I do agree with that. I think it's lots of it is that the being open and honest, right? And that uh, it's also testing how well your arguments can take, right? And take shape, right? So even if we are independently looking to do certain things in a particular way, and we think that we have this down packed and exactly this is the way to do certain things, we trust each other enough so that we are open, right, to have a real dialogue to test that theory, whether that is in fact 100%. Can you go 90%? Can you go even 20%? And trusting that the other, when they make the argument, you would agree to change your mind. And so we are constantly also battling our own personal egos, right? And putting that aside because we want to, do the best thing possible, and then allowing, and understanding that there may be other methodologies, ideas that could make your initial thoughts even better, and that is huge. So in some ways, right, that is both intellectual, but it's also very, very personal. We all have this tendency of saying, yeah, what I believe is what I believe in, and you should follow me. And so we actually don't have that kind of yeah, it's my name, whose name's going first, shut up, I would rather not have my name there. because it actually makes things work better and tactically and strategically better sometimes to have some individual to move forward and others to lay back. So, and then, splitting up, right? Who's gonna, you know, I mean, in terms of quote, watching each other back, right? So, okay, for this particular situation, you take the lead, you know, or that you be the good guy and I'll be the bad guy. So, it's actually thinking through how we can do, problem solve on a consistent basis. And I think that, over time, it's so, it's built up to such a strong foundation that there is this, again, it's really about the trust. But also we're also intellectually, rather rigorous, right? In thinking about things, that the and how we over time, even when we are not doing the exact work, the work that we will continue to do still shares that essential, idea of so that when we do actually get to sit and chat about whatever issue, that it seems like even if it's like 10 years later or 5 years later, is a conversation that we just had 5 minutes ago, with the same level of understanding as to, oh yeah, I understand exactly where you're trying to go with that particular activity, because I could hear, that, the core of the thinking process. So I think that's where, when people say, oh yeah, this is a great relationship, it just, at the end of the day, I mean, truly, we think about it. Um, when did we actually do, really tight work? You could just imagine, right? I mean, um, when was the last time that we had anything to do at Mocha, right? So there are many years in between. But when the call is asked, I need you here, and it's at a moment's notice, we'll be there. I think that's important.
That's
Just to add a little bit to
Mhm.
that, which is that I think we both reflect about ourselves and we're actually tough about ourselves. And then when we can do that with each other, it actually means that we can be tough with each other, but that doesn't mean that we diminish our sense of respect for ourselves or for each other, right?
Agreed.
And that ability to reflect and learn because of that is kind of key. I think we're always learning. We never think we know everything.
Mhm.
So when Charlie talks about ego, I think that's part of what he's talking about, is that we're always looking to learn, and it's not about personalities or putting our names out there. It's about trying to do what we do better, So I think that's a lot of our temperaments in that way are very similar. Yeah. So
I just want to
That's-
say really quick, I know
Yeah.
Carolyn has a question, but I think that what you're describing really has allowed Mocha, regardless of current state or what's in the future. I think that the way you approach your friendship actually has allowed Mocha to exist this long, and the absence of ego has allowed Mocha, at one point, to be really an inspiration and a dream for so many people. And that so many people feel some ownership over Mocha because you allowed for that space.
I think, yeah, in some way, like the word about allowing, it's the, we are looking at the organization as a place for, uh, and well, let me just actually rephrase that. This is the history of our community. We don't know any better. So, it's our collective history. So, uh, we may have some of the initial, tools or the framework for it. But without the others, I mean, I'm talking about everybody else around us, we can't do that work. So, and so the allowance, so to speak, is actually not an allowance per se, but it's actually a requirement, right? A requirement for others to have that ownership, to have that sharing, to have that input. Um, allowing someone is that we govern, we rule the day. There's something. So for like yeah, you can't take this pot of money and do that thing because it's the way against everything else. Um, but I think the spirit of what we're trying to do is that this is our community's history, and so and taking the multiple skill sets to be part of that overall work um, um, allows the organization to feel so to feel so dynamic. Um, um, again, I go back to my again, not kidding around, right? Do I really know that much about art and culture? No. Do I really know that much about history? No. But those who have more of that inclination or more of that skill set, more of that talent, they were brought in, or they were brought in, they were invited, they moved themselves in to be part of that, and that actually enhances all of our work. So, and I value, what they bring to the table. And so, and their voice at that particular moment for that particular activity, they are the leadership for that activity because, they're so much better at it than I. So, and why the hell not? That, they are part of that, driving force. And I think when people are engaged into this work in association with the organization, they feel empowered and empowered and also have the ownership. And I think that keeps that the spirit and the sense of aura that you know um uh, you know, they are in fact the organization, not just Jack and Charlie. Yeah, right. Thank you. But it's their organization, and that ownership goes a long way. And through that aura, that many other people saying that yeah, I belong. I can belong. You can belong too. I think that is really what we were in some ways successful at, right?
I would like to just say, I mean, just state, not to be the master of the obvious, but I mean, here we are, we're two Filipinas who are have Mocha in our hearts just as much as the community that you both come from, or the community you both come from. I know we talked about you being inspirational to us, but what you created or what you started along with everybody, as you've said, who've inspired you and who were a part of that, I think it just speaks volumes to the fact that I mean, even if I could just put Nancy and I in sort of, on the spot, I mean, like, we love Mocha, and this is one of the reasons why we're doing this talk. This is one of the reasons why we continue to be involved in drawing out these stories. I think it speaks to the power of what you were just saying, that this is about finding a place that is dynamic, that is authentic, that is open, that pushes the questions, that yes, it's specifically about this community, but it doesn't isolate itself from this larger context of what is America, or what is American, or where we're trying to go as a larger community, with our specificities as well as our differences, or our commonalities as well as our differences. I wanted to also mention that it must have been a risk, right, to come together, to build that trust and openness. And then on sort of the other side of building the institution, there was also a risk, I imagine, from being a project and then to deciding becoming a museum. Like, could you speak to that part, that shift, coming from the grassroots to then saying we will institutionalize? And what was the thinking around that? What were the navigations and the risk involved?
I'll answer first. I mean, I think when you're trained to be in museum studies or whatever, which we never were, then perhaps one could think of it as, oh, it's a big decision and it's a big risk and all that kind of stuff. We just kind of stumbled into it, really. So there's no really big answer to this. So for me, the answer is that, wow, we started collecting a lot of things. It went from just being in one closet to taking over whole sections of the spaces that we were renovating. And then before you knew it, there's a collection there and we had to take it seriously. And I think for me, these objects, these slippers, these suitcases, these photographs, these letters, all those things that started coming in are not just things. They're actually about people's lives and parts of stories that we don't know yet. And there's that kind of respect, I think, that we have for those elders who embodied that, the elders that we never met. So in some ways, I think it took a reformulation of who was our family and who were we linked to, who were our kin in that sense. And if you're kind of a historian or if you have a historical imagination, which is more broad and inclusive, then just about anything you find has an amazing story. And it's just a matter of finding someone who could tell that story about that thing or a comparable story. So I think that kind of sense of connection to the past and generations of the past is also what we try to connect to generations of the future. And that spirit of connection and meaning of memory making through these objects and through these stories is, I think, really, probably for me, the deepest experience in this is that it becomes a way to meet people and to talk with people, whether they're from Chinatown or not, whether they're Asian American or not, that speaks to a deeper human connection. That so it offered a vocabulary and a way of understanding life and a way of connecting and a way of kind of not just organizing, but a way of being part and helping to build something much greater and larger. So for me, it's really a way of imagining a different world and a way of making a different world. And that it's not about control and domination, which is really how the corporate world works and how corporate forms of organization work. It's not the way the city government works, which is very much along those colonial models. It's not a top-down approach. It has to be infused with that kind of meaning and storytelling and way of connecting and doing it over food and things that are meaningful in everyday life that can make all the difference in the world, right? So in some ways, what I learned out of that process, then I've just been continuing to try to learn as I work with other groups of people. Right now, I'm really not doing Asian American or Chinatown work, but I'm learning that, for example, from Chief Vincent Mann, who is a Munsee Lenape chief of the Turtle Clan of the Rampo Lenape people, Rampo Lenape Nation in northern New Jersey, that there's lots of comparability. So he talks about humility all the time. And in some ways, that's what his version of the word of what we were just talking about in terms of not being driven by ego, being really thinking about what's best for the, what's the best thing that other people can do and stepping aside when you realize that, right? And so for me, I know that from basketball, because different people are different heights and different abilities. And Charlie may be short, but he's also really fast, or he was really fast. Maybe he's not so fast anymore, but I'm not so tall anymore either. So we're all different, and we can all play a role in working together as a team. And I think from those days and from just playing sports in a positive way, it also then means as you go through different stages in your life, you pick up and learn and kind of add to that kind of understanding of how things can work and how things can be different.
I want to follow up with the think about the issue of risk. Interestingly, I never thought that we were taking any risk. We just, we just thought, like and Jack's right. We did not know what we were doing, but we know that we were doing the right thing. We don't know how to get there. We're confident enough to then think through at least the next 3 steps, how to take the next 3 steps. And then over time, we actually figured out we could do 5 steps in terms of planning. So, um, so uh, never saw there's a risk because we never felt that we were going to fall over any cliff because we're smart enough to, to see it 3 steps in advance that, cliff is over there, we're going to, veer off to another direction. Or we will, figure out some things to go over that cliff, right? And to build something. So I think that's the, um, uh, you know, really try. It all goes back to really thinking through what are we doing and how we doing it on a constant basis, and not to be locked down on, this is one way of doing it and that's the only pathway, no matter what. I think we have a really good general direction. Um, um, so finding, various pathways to get there um, was really important. Now, so thinking through, the progression of that organizational life, right? From a project. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you know, I remember when we were looking at doing the China History Project, we thought, oh, we'll take care of it in 4 years, and we'll get into working to document other Asian American communities within the city, within the region, nationally, because we had this Asian American Research Institute, online, and then we're going to take care of the Asian American community in general, really soon thereafter. And then we got this Center of Community Studies that we would link up with the Schomburg and the, Institute of Public Studies and et cetera, that we're going to work with them on the, larger collaborative. I mean, we have that grand plan. 40 odd years later, we still don't know enough about Chinatown. So, so yeah, we were naive. But it's also about communities constantly evolving, right? And this also, requires, deeper and deeper understanding. So, and really does, humbles you, right? Humbles us, right? To think about, yeah, we don't know enough. And there are many others that have to be part of this, this grouping to make things happen. So, um, and and so at the same time, when we move from the history project, right, to start renaming, right, to calling ourselves a museum, um, we were concerned, right? Museums by that word, imply certain things, and we were rather rigorous to not want to be simply this one place that you have to have your card to get in, you know uh, and that the and we are trying to define um, that institution that um, we want, not what somebody else wants. And throughout that growth process, we were at the forefront of many, um, um, you know, um, uh, strategic work from oral history. We were, at the forefront of that. We were incorporating, how, art and design, is a complement to the work that we do. How language is being used, in equal weights. How we bring in, different methodologies in broadcasting, the information that we found. We have to think about why we do exhibits, and who's it for, and why we're doing that, and how we capitalize on that as an organizing strategy, right? All of these things were us thinking through um, that museum of ours moving forward, is not what a typical definition of this, typical institutional framework, right? The definitions. And so when we ask those kind of questions, um, and that thinking of our place within the community, we also have to then deal with, how scholarship work, how museum studies, or how advanced management, staff, should and could be part of that, um, and how should they reframe their skill sets into an institution that is more resonating, right, with the community that we need to serve, that we are part of. So I think those are key conversations, including, right, the fact that and these also dealing with irony, right? We have such strong egos, my goodness, and yet we're also very humble, right? How do you navigate that, right? So I knew, you know, we are going to do great work and we're going to have a significant impact, you know, not just in terms of scholarship or community development, but we also contributors. I mean, when we moved to, Center Street, I knew we were, going to gentrify the neighborhood. And, I was thinking hard, seriously about how that is going to impact the community. But what we do, not as an instrument of, a negative instrument, right? But how do we, understand our place, as a museum, that will enhance, right, the community. But enhancing the community's life doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to succumb to, that um, um, betterment, as a negative, uh, component of, gentrification. So, but it's having to deal with these issues. Honestly, it's difficult. Um, and oftentimes we beat each other's heads in, and trying to think through that. If we do this, what could happen? If those things could be happening, what do we do about it? And I think those are important and critical questions that we constantly talk to ourselves, right, with each other over the last 48 years. That the uh, uh, and that really informed us, right, in how we do the work within the organization and also ongoing work outside of it.
Yeah, Charlie, I'm just thinking as you're speaking about form and design, and then some of the discussions we would have. So we would have maybe days of ongoing discussions about fixing up your parents' apartment, or what does that mean, and what role can people who are renovating apartments play in doing it in a good way that's not promoting gentrification, but also the complexity of, well, people are living in shitty conditions.
Yep.
And need to improve. And
Yep.
if you can't do it yourself and you don't have a community-based organization that's doing it, then how else is it going to happen if it relies on the landlord, right? So we would go pretty deep into those complexities and then try to come up, well, not necessarily come up with that discussion, what we would do out of that discussion, but we'd come up with some version of how do we understand changes. And so I wasn't so much directly involved in that decision to move, although I kind of was fortunate to kind of hear your thinking and to visit the site. But I knew from the earlier discussions that there was much more complexity, and that I would trust that if you were making that decision, then that would work, that we would be able to do it in a good way. Now, it's always tricky when an organization transitions and changes, then is that good way going to continue or not? It's hard to say. But I am heartened, because when we were talking about, well, should we just end the organization, when there are many moments in which the organization was going to implode or whatever, because of financial or because of the leadership at the time and because, all those things. You were pretty clear that, well, if the organization dies, it dies, right? And then it became a question. So what's the most important part of what the organization is? And for me, a lot of it's the collection, right? That collection is so invaluable and has so many stories to tell. And we haven't even begun to really do that, but does the rest of the organization have to stay on, especially in this digital age, especially, when things can take other forms, so in some ways, I think in those discussions, which are other than the ones about renovation of apartments in Chinatown, then it got me thinking about, so what does it mean, right, for the life cycle of an organization? What does it mean when organizations and communities have to go through transitions amidst the incredible real estate market and the way everything in New York City is being financialized, against all odds, right? Everything is being financialized and marketed. So those kinds of larger questions would always be also brought into our discussion so that we would come up with some kind of, during lunch or whatever, some kind of not resolution, but some kind of an understanding. And then who knows when that discussion or what we took from those, kind of particular deep dives, who knows when those insights would be useful in another situation, right?
To your point, Jack, about the collections being one of the most important things about the organization, and not just because of this being a very digital point in time, digital age. It's also a time of COVID and living through a pandemic. And for, both of those reasons, I think that it's very important that people and community are still able to be together in person and have a place that they can gather and feel a sense of belonging. And I mean, I think that that's really the only reason to have a physical space and a museum, and why it's also important. So I'd love to hear how you both are thinking in this time, this uncertainty of how we come together, how we form community, and the original hopes for MoCA. Where does it, I know that you both are not involved on a daily basis, or I mean, you can characterize that yourselves. But do you have thoughts on MoCA, or even sort of just larger thoughts about this point in time in contrast to when you started MoCA?
I constantly think about organizational development and life cycles, and so I think you guys and I have lots of conversation about what I do and how I do things. I am an organizer, and as an organizer, as a organization builder, right? My job is to get to a point of helping to build an organization to a point where it must survive beyond me, and must survive beyond the present context of the staff, if it is to continue. So, can I continue to stay involved? Yes. Do I need to stay involved? No. If that institution is of value to the people and to the community, the people in the community would make it responsive to it, right? So, and if I could do wonderful things, right, and nobody cares, it's gonna die on its own, So it's only gonna be the community people that will keep it thriving. So, and I really do believe in that, and because as an egomaniac as I am, I'm also again going back to being humble to then say, well, the fact is that if there are new leadership, they should be able to take it to where they need it to go. Okay, and if they were responsive to to the community and to the people who support it, and the institution is resonating with them, then we'll continue. If not, they will hold that leadership accountable and change it. So, in its present state, right? That we go back to this sense of the aura of the History Project and the founding of MoCA is it's a place where people can feel safe for to have discussions. Back in the day, right, going back 40 odd years ago, I went to the back to talk to the folks in the back. We were having conversations. yeah, the multiple folks in their little corners within the 7th floor loft have their own little corners, and they believe it's their own fiefdom. When there's an opportunity for conversation, something's happened. Otherwise, they do their own thing. So, and it'll splinter if they're only doing their own thing, right? So, the spirit of what I believe, right? The History Project in Mocha was, given Jack and I clearly have very different experiences, and just as you guys have very different experience from us, right? That it's a place that from our own individual, unique, somewhat unique journeys, you could find a place where you could feel comfortable to have a conversation. That your experience is just as legitimate as another's, just as important. We refuse for very, very long times to summarily, interview, right? Or document, the rich and famous, right? The generals or the renowned. Because yeah, they are part of the story, but they're not the exclusive story, right? It's whose shoulders were they riding on? Well, the laundry workers, the restaurant workers, the people that are now living in Chung Park, that are now 90, 500 years old. We're all, living off their work and their shoulders. And so they are even more important than those rich and famous. Now, when we were going through, those galas, right, bringing in, and honoring internationally, famous individuals, what did they say? I had my first shop on Canal Street. I had my first studio on Canal Street. I worked as a seamstress. And they're international stars. And they are unafraid to talk about, quote, their humble past. This is part of the history. And so if we are able to make those folks, right, acknowledge this continual, it's not just a threat, right? It's the anchor, right? They understand that. It's again, that's part of the journey. So I'm looking at, Mocha. We have so many different individuals, ideas and thoughts, and must be a welcoming place for that conversation. Difficult. But unless you have those difficult conversations, we're not going to get very anywhere. And it will only be a select, entity for a select group of people that are like-minded. So, I also, like I'm jumping back and forth too, right? To then say, back in the days when I was much more radical, right? In that, if the revolution happens tomorrow, who's going to run the shop? And the revolution is imminently going to be happening because the 3 or 4 people that you talk to all agree. But what about the 5th person, the 10th person? So it's all about what we think we know, what we think we want. If we're not as inclusive as we can, we're at a loss. We're not going to succeed. And so, this is what I think about why we were doing, Mocha and trying to create this sense that everyone is welcoming, and that it is an obligation, right, for the institution that we were part of, right, to be that embracing. And if it's changed, then it now is up to the people and the community to say what do they want. So because at the end of the day, Jack was talking about, everything is monetized, right? Yeah, we totally monetize our community's political capital. We monetized it to get to where we are. And so the fund development is not about, the rich and famous plunking in. Well, you know what? They didn't plunk in multi-million dollars for this organization ever. All right. So the multi-million dollars came from our community's capital, political capital. And so they are the owners, not the individuals that, have a name that is internationally renowned. Okay. And, and he's looking at, that truth. Um, um, uh, and the power, right, is that we've been so, through so many generations, right, is that, yeah, we've been made to believe that they hold the power. They don't hold the power. But do we only if we exercise that, we, would lose that power. So, um, and yeah, anyway, so I just want to kind of stop there.
Just to maybe add, from a different point of view, I tend not to, and I think Charlie tends not to look back and wanting to control and dominate. I think our basic attitude is that when we are able to make a difference, in whatever role we play, then we try to do our best. But, I think both of us have moved on to other organizing efforts. And, for me, I'm now actually trying to use and learn and reflect back upon what I've learned before in various efforts, and now apply it in an even more difficult situation where I am. And it becomes a challenge to not be the founder, let's say, of an organization, but to actually be someone who's succeeding the founder. It's a very different position to be in. And, a man who was just amazing, kind, gentle, everybody was his friend. Lots of stories about all of that. And then how do you build an organization out of those conditions, and with communities that are not one's own in terms of, Asian American or Chinese American or the particular part of China that you're coming from, but really of a very different group of people, and so how can history, those kinds of identifications, those attachments to place, a sense of time, and the kind of conversations that we can have over food, but also over matters that people really care about. How can those conversations continue in this different context? So, I'm actually, I know it's a 10-year plan, but I'm having, in some ways, the biggest challenges in my life right now, and in some ways, it's a lot of fun as well. I kind of wish everybody I've worked with in the past can kind of come along on this journey. Most people probably don't want to bother, but so for me, it's I think as you become an organizer, you begin to realize that there's always new organizing opportunities, and how much do you want to go back to try to revisit something, especially when the conditions are really difficult. I mean, when it comes down to how do you convert people's goodwill, people's energy, what people want to do into sustaining an organization, those are really difficult things, but and some people may think that it's just money, and that somehow if you just make the right decisions or have the right expertise or have the right pedigree, then that answer will come. We know that's not how it happens. It really happens because people really believe and then apply their best they can apply to a situation. It takes a lot of people to do that. I think what I've come to realize that I'm now in a university system, and it's not about the jobs and the job descriptions. It's not about any of those things. It's really about what people want to do, what students want to do as volunteers, not outside of the classroom or in addition to what they've agreed to get credits for. What do people who are on the edge of retirement want to do something that is meaningful that they haven't had a chance to do, even though they started maybe their job with those ideas in mind, but they've never been able to quite get to them. And to me, the big challenge is really global warming and how to grapple with that. And that's something that, I think we're just not dealing with it. It's too big an issue, but that makes it in some ways all the more important why we need to figure out how to organize around that kind of issue. And then how do we do it in a just way, in a way that's not about just being a little more inclusive and having more crumbs spread around and doing things the same way that have been done before. But what do we need to do to kind of radically change our understanding of our relationship, human relationships to nature itself, and that we're part of nature, not dominant and above nature, so those questions are in some ways just variations of the same questions that Charlie and I were debating back and forth, but applied in a slightly different context and applied with different people as part of the conversation. So for me, I think what I've learned, I can take forward and try to apply into different situations. And I'm always looking for people like Charlie, if not Charlie himself, that I can work with. That's part of the joy, I think, in all this, is finding people who you can really connect with and do sustained, meaningful work with. That's the payment that we get. That's the enjoyment we get, right?
So Jack, you actually touched upon, the future here. And you're talking about the future, or taking us from the present to the future. I think one of our last questions, just in the interest of time, was to ask you both, if you have any last reflections on, your journey thus far together as co-creators, co-builders, collaborators, friends, around MoCA, around the, MoCA, the museum, and then even your current projects potentially. But then also, if you're willing and have an opinion on this, what you see is the potential for MoCA as it is moving forward. I know we skipped over a few other parts of the conversation that could probably lead to this to an answer for this question, but just thinking about, again, the last reflection on, or at least the last reflection for now, on your journey together, and then what you see the potential for the museum as it is, and maybe how it might even connect to some of the work that you've been talking about, Jack, just sort of the larger social issues that surround us that are urgent.
Charlie, did you want to?
Well, I've been talking for now probably like 10, 15 years. I want to go to a cave. So I think honestly, I am not thinking of embarking on new adventures. And because I at the beginning I talked about the idea that I think of things now in terms of a bracketed time frame, and some new adventures will necessarily mean that it would take at least 5 years, which I do not then know if I am able to be engaged in that activity, and that activity being strong enough in my estimation that it could then move forward without my presence in that. So I'm really being very careful as to what things I will get involved in. And Jack and I are really at this point, right, in different worlds, right, and I'm still deeply immersed in Chinatown politics and Chinatown organization work, and Jack is doing much more regional, and some part of the climate change stuff is global. So what I get into, will I at some point touch on some aspect of it? Maybe. Not in the present, and of course Jack is not asking me to get engaged because knowing that I'm somewhat tied up. So I think that
Sometimes I try, Charlie. Sometimes I try, you know.
Oh, you did, but see, so I also get into this place where I don't listen to things, and I I just summarily think dismiss it, and so it was never talked about ever. So so therefore I can then have absolute plausible deniability, right? Um, so so I think that's uh, where I am at right now, um, and um, and as for Mocha, I think that before I talked about uh, 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 I leave it to that institution, to its leadership as to how they will take it forward to the next place. Um, and I qualify it always in that um, if I am available, if they ask, I would never insert myself into something unwelcomed. Um, uh, and also, say to people that, yeah, sure, I'm a co-founder, but that's not my identity. Yeah, sure, I was, the director for multiple years. That's not my identity. And that and do I care? And of course, my typical refrain is, I don't care. Right? But I think the fact is that um, why would I leave? If I wanted to do things in a particular way, right? And so I left because there is one of the reasons, right, is that it is believed that the institution um, could do better, could do different, and let it be so. Um, so um, uh, so in that sense, right, the institution, if it is going to succeed, and it will succeed in some capacity, some way, maybe different from you or me, but it'll do the best it can. Now, if you want to change it, right, and this go back to my own philosophy, right? If you find meaning to that place, and that place needs to change to be resonating with you, then it's up to you to make that happen. Um, so and so that future, I would hope, right, that if there's such a thing called legacy on my part, is that the legacy is that the community would hold, right, that institution accountable, so that it will continue to be resonating to the changing, and evolving, Chinatown Asian American community. Um, that's what I wish. Um, and so, if nobody cares, then fine, let it go. So anyway, that's what I see, right? And that I am right now, right, really immersed, right, with the borough-based jail, that is being built right next to, Chung Park, the building I'm in, and all of that, all of the issues from physical infrastructure related issues to, political stuff, and how I secure, the building over the next, 60 and 99 years, given the building that I'm negotiating with the city of New York. So I'm doing, some work around it, um, and I am working towards, a point where um, uh, it can be handed off to someone to do and to follow up and make it better. Um, um, so um, anyway, that's what I'm wishing, hoping in the next steps.
Well, maybe I'll add to what I'm framing as intergenerational transfer of knowledge, which is that, with global warming issues, the window we have is basically 6 years and 200 days and counting before what scientists will say that the converging cascading impacts of multiple impacts of pandemics, fires, rising waters. I mean, it's kind of a biblical kind of notion, of what's going to start happening. And we're already seeing it happen, maybe sometimes faster than we thought it would. in any given summer or droughts and things like that. I mean, huge parts of the world now are having serious water problems, for example. And, in the Philippines, that there's massive changes of the impacts of global warming. So to me, the key for this is how all these spaces that we've been involved in organizing can somehow get together and put down whatever differences of pride or ego have generated, and really focus on the real big questions that we all have to face. And the only way we're going to face it is not so much from some magic bullet of technology or some president of the university or of the mayor of the city or president of the United States are going to be able to solve. We're humbled by the scope of what's going on right now and the sheer magnitude. So the only way we're going to get together is actually if we can begin to work across generations and across differences, and really organize more on a grassroots level, but also impacting the institutions that we're in, both from the inside out, but also from the outside in, and both from the top down, but also from the bottom up. So to me, the theory of change hasn't really changed that much. It has to be through not the job description or through the money you're being paid to do whatever you're doing, but through really coming together around these bigger challenges and being able to organize those spaces to make that happen. So in terms of kind of the cross-generational transfer of knowledge, I mean, both Charlie and I have hit what most people have hit in terms of retirement age. I'm actually not planning on retiring at all. And I'm not convinced Charlie's planning on retiring either, but that's another
That's a discussion.
So, I mean, he's going to go into the cave, but something's going to happen to that cave. So in any case, I think there's always a role for everybody to play in this. And, I think part of the wisdom I've gleaned from indigenous philosophy and thinking is, we've heard a lot about the 7 generations, and people tend to think of thinking 7 generations ahead and 7 generations back. The way it's been explained to me also by another elder, which I think is really in some ways more effective, is that we're the 4th generation. We're the pivot between 3 generations before us and after us. And that we know those people, they're living people that we know already, or the memories of their lives are still with us. So they're actually the real spirits and the real people we've engaged with. We've known enough people now in the course of our decades of work in Chinatown that a lot of people have passed. So we can think of 3 generations of people in Chinatown, but this is in the larger Lower East Side, the larger region, who we've known, and we've worked with, and we connected with, and we've been transformed by that connection. And that we also know 3 generations younger than us, whether it's our children, our family members, or extended, friends and family, or extended communities. So the change we have to bring has to be able to constantly transfer from one generation to the next, so that we're connecting with those people enough so we actually have something we feel we can carry on, and it could be our parents, it could be Paul Siu, who wrote the dissertation on Chinese laundryman. It could be anybody. But along the way, we've met those people. And then how do we try to distill what we've learned from them and carry it on and pass it on to the next generation? So for me, that's the challenge. It can be in any context. It could be a MOCA. It could be in any organizational situation. But how can we take what we've learned seriously and not simply be sidelined because we've technically retired, but we haven't retired. We haven't retired from the kind of organizing role that we can all play in doing this kind of work. So the challenge then is, how do we transfer that knowledge and find places in which it's not, most people don't want to listen to what we have to say. So, I'm clear enough about that. But for those few who are interested, which I appreciate this being an opportunity for that, then there's a chance to actually transfer that knowledge, right? And to engage in that process. So in that way, I think we're both small, but also pivotal, right? We're unique for whatever reasons, and our relationship is unique, but we can also transfer the spirit of that and also what we learned in that process. And hopefully that will continue in some way or another.
Yeah, well said.
Oh, let me
Thank
also
you.
say, could I also say that, Charlie had a very different role than I had, so, I mean, I could still have time to read books and to go out and get coffee. And Charlie, in some ways, I mean, Charlie was in the trenches much more than I was. And I have to say that because that's also a very rough place to be. And it's day to day, it's constant. I'm in a different kind of set of trenches, but not quite the same. And I think it just wears on us differently because of that, so I just want to acknowledge that and say that there is that difference. And generally, it's oftentimes gendered labor, that is different. So not all labor is the same. And, for me to be able to say I'm going to do another 10 years, it's because I'm in a privileged position in academia and in a position at the university where I can do more good things and more fun things than not, right? There's a bureaucracy here. There's a lot of other stuff I don't like, but I'm lucky that way. So not everybody is in the same kind of position. So I want to acknowledge that. And Charlie's been in the trenches doing lots of incredible things in that process. So I think the pivots for MoCA that have been critical for New York Chinatown History Project, to Chinatown History Museum, to MoCA, are really because of the day-to-day work that Charlie and the staff that he's worked with. You guys are involved in that, so you know what I'm talking about. That day-to-day grind, and the only way that the day-to-day grind can be meaningful is if there's some larger purpose of doing it. It's not just because it's a job. It's not because it's in your job role. It's not because there's a corporate structure above you. So you're doing it by fear, or you're checking off all the things that you're supposed to do. That's not the reason why people are doing this work. There's a larger reason. So that's a spirit that I think is so important for all the work we do, and for why I think to whatever degree that has continued on in MoCA or used to exist more prominently in MoCA, that's what I think we try to bring in any situation we're in. So.
Jack, that was amazing what you said. And we are now going to repeat it to Charlie every time he says he's going into a cave. He may go into a cave, but something is going to happen in or to that cave.
No, I've been messed over once before, and that is, I thought I was retired from ISS, and it was just simply 2 weeks later, and I got pulled into this stuff with the jail stuff. So um, um, I'm really trying. I'm really trying to monitor as to what is it that um, I have to do. And this is actually the difficult part of in some ways, right? Evaluating and reflecting the work is that throughout these last 40-odd years, right, the work is all about just doing it. It's the fun thing. It is no obligation, um, and that there's not a sense of burden. And this last few years, I'm feeling it's a burden, um, and 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 perhaps it's my own ego tripping right now, and um, I actually had to evaluate, given the jail related work and how it impacted, the Chongpacto building and how to navigate that. There weren't very many people that actually can do that job. And so it became a burden, right? Um, that I have to step up um, to make that difference. And I had never had to feel, I never felt that before. And so um, it's unpleasant. Um, yeah, of course I could do the work. I mean, I am, so I am an egomaniac. I could do the work. I could navigate. I could do that. I could do this, and whatever. But it's yeah, the it's all simply in my view, right? Problem solving. Yeah, the different levels of problem solving thing. Is it for the community? Absolutely. Is it for the future? Absolutely. All of those things all checked off all the boxes. But in a sense that I'm not free to do it. I'm forced to do it, and so that contrarian of me is rebelling against that. And that's that's a very unhappy situation for me. And trying to get to a place where in in a year and a half, when things are much more aligned. And then I could choose to do things, not to be, the key, right? To quote disaster, or to avoiding the disaster, and that's just not where I want to be. It's unfortunate, but uh, so and again, like trying to wrap it back to this mocha thing, right? It's like, am I key to making certain things happen within the institution? I don't think so. And with that, then others, then should have that opportunity, right? Needs to be in that place, to carry it forward. I think that's really important to state, because now, going back 40 odd years ago, right? In the early 20s, and man, I'm thinking those folks that are over 50 should retire, because they are dragging our community down. I am 67. Thank you very much. So, I mean, these people, I am included, need to vacate, quote, that community leadership to create spaces, right, for people like you, because it's your time, your place, to lead the community. These old folkies like me, need to move aside to help, but to move aside, not to, uh, suck up the oxygen in the room. So,
You mean the oxygen in a cave?
wow. Well, no,
Because we're gonna follow you in a cave. I'm just kidding.
Oh no, I then go back to I'm going back to like just as in college, I'm taking yoga. I would take yoga, and then I would breathe really slowly and shallowly, and being very efficient with my oxygen intake. Meditating.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much. Thanks to the two of you, and also thank you to Carolyn for being here and being such a great partner. I hope we get to revisit this conversation in like 2 or 3 more years and see. I mean, Charlie, how do you know that Carolyn and I don't want to go into a cave? Like,
That is a very good point.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, that's the stage we're at.
I am the weird one. You guys are not. So therefore, then by definition, that's not going to happen.
Well,
But
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you to both of you, and Nancy also. Just
thank you.
keeping
No,
quiet
this is great. Thank you
together.
so much.
Yeah.
And of course, it's been quite a while since I had the opportunity to talk to Jack. So, this is actually, great. And really appreciate you guys, putting this together. So thank you. And all of your kind words.
They're true words, Charlie. They're true words.
The element of truth.
Not just kind. They really are true. Until they're not. No, I'm just kidding. But it's been wonderful.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
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 See you soon.
Bye.